Every Tuesday and Thursday at 0500 hours, she wheeled her stainless steel cart through the corridors of Quantico Marine Base, serving breakfast to some of the most elite warriors in the world. But to them, Sandra Lopez was invisible, just another face behind the serving line. Someone who ladled scrambled eggs and poured coffee for Marines who barely acknowledged her existence. They had no idea that the quiet woman in the hairnet and apron, who smiled politely and called them sir and ma'am, was about to shatter everything they thought they knew about who belonged in their world of precision, power, and deadly skill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:15 a.m., but Sandra Lopez was already awake. She'd been staring at the ceiling of her small apartment for the past 20 minutes, running through the same mental checklist she'd used for the last 8 months. Check the perimeter. Assess potential threats. Identify escape routes. Old habits. Died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. Sandra rolled out of bed with the fluid motion of someone half her age, despite being 42 years old. At 5 feet 3 inches with shoulder-length black hair always pulled back in a practical bun, she looked exactly like what the Marines expected from a civilian cafeteria worker. Plain khaki pants, sensible shoes, and a blue polo shirt that bore the food services contractor logo. Nothing about her appearance suggested she'd once been capable of dropping a target at 800 meters in a crosswind. The drive to Quantico took 18 minutes, exactly the same as it had every workday for 8 months. Sandra parked her 10-year-old Honda Civic in the same spot, 3rd row back, near the exit, with clear sight lines to all approaches. She'd learned long ago that survival often depended on the smallest details, the habits that seemed paranoid to civilians, but were second nature to operators. The cafeteria kitchen was already bustling when Sandra arrived at 4:45 a.m. Maria Santos, the head cook, barely looked up from the industrial-sized pot of oatmeal she was stirring. "Morning, Sandy. You're on serving line today." Marines start coming through at 0530. Sandy, that's what they all called her. A harmless nickname for a harmless woman who served food and cleaned tables and never caused any trouble. None of them knew that Sandra had specifically requested the serving line position because it gave her visual access to every person who entered the facility. None of them questioned why she always positioned herself at the station that provided the best overwatch of all entrances and exits. The first Marines began filtering through at exactly 0530, just as they had every morning for 8 months. Sandra fell into the familiar rhythm of serving breakfast, but her eyes never stopped moving. She cataloged faces, noted unusual behavior, tracked movement patterns. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job. In reality, she was conducting surveillance with the kind of systematic precision that would have impressed intelligence. "Analysts, eggs, sir?" she asked Corporal Martinez, one of the regulars. He was 22, from Texas, specialized in communications, and had a tendency to check his phone obsessively, a security vulnerability she'd noted months ago. "Yeah, thanks," Martinez mumbled, not bothering to make eye contact. To him, Sandra was part of the furniture. Useful, forgettable, beneath notice. Staff Sergeant Williams came through the line next. Sandra had been watching him particularly closely for the past 3 weeks. Something about his behavior had changed. He'd become jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. His financial situation appeared to be deteriorating based on observations of his personal effects and eating habits. In Sandra's experience, desperate people made poor decisions, and poor decisions in a military environment could have catastrophic consequences. "Morning, ma'am," Williams said, and Sandra noted the slight tremor in his voice. Stress indicators were becoming more pronounced. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant. The usual?" Sandra's tone was warm and maternal, the voice of someone who remembered how everyone liked their eggs. But behind her friendly demeanor, she was calculating threat assessments and risk probabilities. The morning rush continued for 2 hours. Sandra served approximately 400 Marines, tracked behavioral anomalies in 12 individuals, and identified 3 potential security concerns, all while maintaining the cheerful efficiency expected from cafeteria staff. It was a balancing act that required the kind of compartmentalization most people couldn't sustain for 8 minutes, let alone 8 months. Captain Jennifer Hayes was the exception to the general pattern of dismissal. Unlike most of the Marines, who treated Sandra as invisible, Hayes actually seemed to see her as a person. She asked about Sandra's weekend plans, remembered details from previous conversations, and always said please and thank you. It was the kind of basic courtesy that had become rare in Sandra's current assignment. "How's your nephew doing with his college applications?" Hayes asked as Sandra served her whole grain toast and fresh fruit. The captain was one of the few Marines who consistently made healthy choices. "He's doing well. Thank you for asking. Still deciding between engineering programs." The nephew was fictional, part of Sandra's carefully constructed cover identity, but she'd developed the backstory in enough detail to maintain consistency across months of casual conversations. Hayes nodded and moved on, but not before Sandra noticed something that made her pause. The captain's service weapon wasn't properly secured. The holster retention strap was loose, and the weapon itself was sitting at an angle that suggested hasty replacement. For someone of Hayes' rank and experience, such carelessness was unusual and potentially significant. The breakfast rush ended at 0800, and Sandra transitioned to her secondary duties, cleaning tables, restocking supplies, and preparing for the lunch service. But these tasks also served her primary mission. Moving through the dining area gave her access to conversations, documents left on tables, and behavioral observations of off-duty personnel. She was wiping down a table near the window when she overheard a conversation that made her freeze. 2 Marines at the next table were discussing ammunition discrepancies in the armory. Weapons and ammunition going missing from military facilities was exactly the kind of intelligence she'd been tasked to investigate. Third time this month. "We've come up short on the inventory count," one of them was saying. "Lieutenant Morrison thinks it's just paperwork errors, but I don't know. The numbers don't add up." Sandra continued cleaning, her movements steady and unremarkable, but her attention was completely focused on the conversation. After 8 months of patient observation, she might finally have found what she was looking for. The Marines finished their conversation and left, but Sandra had memorized every detail. Names, dates, quantities, patterns. Information that would need to be carefully analyzed and cross-referenced with other intelligence she'd gathered during her time at Quantico. As the morning shift ended and Sandra prepared for her afternoon break, she reflected on the strange duality of her current existence. To the Marines, she was Sandra Lopez, the friendly cafeteria worker who remembered how they liked their coffee and never caused any trouble. But Sandra Lopez was as much a fiction as her nephew's college applications. Her real name was Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera, former CIA operative with 15 years of experience in deep cover assignments. She'd operated in Syria, Afghanistan, and 3 countries that didn't officially appear on her resume. She'd been decorated for valor, recommended for promotion, and entrusted with classified operations that could shift the balance of power in entire regions. And then her younger brother Miguel had been killed, not in combat, not in some foreign desert, but right here on American soil. Shot dead by weapons that had been stolen from a military armory and sold to criminals on the black market. Weapons that should have been secured, accounted for, and protected by the very system Miguel had died serving. The official investigation had stalled after 6 months. Too many dead ends, too many bureaucratic obstacles, too many people with too much to lose if the truth came out. But Sandra had resources the official investigators lacked. She had patience, skills, and most importantly, she had nothing left to lose. So she'd taken leave from the CIA, created a new identity, and embedded herself in the one place where she could investigate her brother's death from the inside. For 8 months, she'd been Sandra Lopez, invisible cafeteria worker. But beneath the hairnet and apron, she was still Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera, and she was hunting. The conversation she'd overheard about missing ammunition might be the break she'd been waiting for. After 8 months of watching, listening, and gathering intelligence, she might finally be close to finding the people responsible for putting those weapons on the street. The people who killed Miguel. Sandra finished cleaning her station and headed to the break room, her mind already working through the implications of what she'd learned. She had to be careful. One wrong move, one blown cover, and 8 months of work would be wasted. But she also couldn't afford to wait much longer. Every day the trail grew colder. Every day the people responsible had more time to cover their tracks. As she sat in the break room, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home, Sandra looked like any other middle-aged cafeteria worker taking her afternoon break. But appearances, as the Marines were about to learn, could be devastatingly deceiving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lunch rush on Thursday brought an unexpected opportunity. Sandra was restocking the salad bar when she noticed Lieutenant Aaron Morrison arguing with Sergeant Blake Thompson near the back corner table. Their voices were low, but Sandra had learned to read lips during her second tour in Afghanistan, a skill that proved invaluable when eavesdropping was the difference between life and death. Morrison was angry about something involving missing inventory reports and too much attention from the wrong people. Thompson kept shaking his head, insisting that the schedule needed to stay on track and that backing out now would raise more questions than continuing. Sandra pretended to struggle with a heavy container of lettuce, positioning herself to get a better angle on their conversation. What she saw made her pulse quicken. Morrison was sliding a small piece of paper across the table to Thompson, the kind of discreet information exchange she'd witnessed countless times in covert operations. Thompson palmed the paper with practiced ease and left immediately. Morrison remained at the table, nervously drumming his fingers against his coffee cup. Sandra noted the stress indicators: rapid breathing, excessive sweating despite the cool temperature, and constant surveillance of his surroundings. These were the behaviors of someone operating under extreme pressure. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice startled Sandra out of her observation. She turned to find Staff Sergeant Williams standing behind her, his lunch tray trembling slightly in his hands. Up close, she could see that his condition had deteriorated significantly since morning. Dark circles under his eyes, unsteady hands, and the distinctive pallor of someone who wasn't sleeping well. "Of course, Staff Sergeant. What can I get for you?" Sandra's voice carried the warm concern of a mother figure, but her trained eye was cataloging every detail of William's appearance and behavior. "I was wondering, do you ever see things? Here in the cafeteria, I mean. Things that don't seem right." William's question was carefully phrased, but Sandra recognized it for what it was: a fishing expedition. Someone testing the waters to see if she might be a potential ally or threat. "I see Marines working hard to serve their country," Sandra replied diplomatically. "Is there something specific that's concerning you?" Williams glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "There are people here who aren't what they seem. People taking things that don't belong to them. People making money off our brothers and sisters in arms." The admission was significant. Williams was either trying to recruit her into something illegal, or he was attempting to expose it. Sandra needed to determine which. "That sounds very serious, Staff Sergeant. Have you reported these concerns to your commanding officer?" Williams laughed bitterly. "That's the problem. I don't know who to trust anymore. The people doing this. They're not outsiders. They're inside the system. They have access, authority, and protection. Before Sandra could respond, Williams noticed Morrison approaching their section of the cafeteria. The staff sergeant immediately straightened up, his demeanor shifting to one of casual friendliness. "Thanks for the extra portions, ma'am. You always take good care of us." Williams moved away quickly, but not before Sandra caught the look of genuine fear in his eyes when he saw Morrison. Morrison ordered his usual turkey sandwich. No condiments, black coffee, but Sandra noticed his hands were steadier than Williams'. Whatever pressure Morrison was under, he was handling it better. That suggested either greater experience with stress or a more secure position in whatever operation they were running. "Beautiful day, isn't it, ma'am?" Morrison's attempt at small talk felt forced, and Sandra recognized it as another probe. He was testing her, trying to gauge whether she'd overheard his conversation with Thompson. "Every day serving you Marines is a beautiful day, Lieutenant," Sandra replied with practiced cheerfulness. But she made sure to include just enough eye contact to suggest she might have seen more than she was letting on. It was a delicate balance, appearing naive enough to be dismissed, but observant enough to potentially be useful. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you see and hear all kinds of interesting things working here every day." "Oh, you'd be surprised how little attention people pay to the help," Sandra said, with a self-deprecating laugh. "Most folks talk right through me like I'm not." Even here, the response seemed to satisfy Morrison, and he moved on. But Sandra had learned something important from the exchange. Morrison was actively assessing potential security threats, which meant their operation was sophisticated enough to include counterintelligence protocols. The afternoon shift brought a different dynamic to the cafeteria. Fewer people, quieter conversations, and more opportunity for detailed observation. Sandra used the slower pace to study personnel files she'd been discreetly copying during her months of access to administrative areas. Her cover position included occasional cleaning, duties in the administrative offices after hours. The building's security was focused on preventing unauthorized entry, not monitoring the activities of trusted civilian employees. Sandra had used this oversight to photograph documents, copy computer files, and access information that painted a clearer picture of the missing weapons situation. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Over the past 18 months, small quantities of ammunition, accessories, and occasionally entire weapons had been reported as lost in training exercises or damaged beyond repair. Individually, each incident seemed minor and believable. Collectively, they represented a systematic diversion of military assets. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the sophistication of the operation. The thefts were occurring across multiple departments, involving different personnel, and being documented through proper channels. Someone with significant knowledge of military procedures and access to multiple systems was coordinating these activities. Sandra cross-referenced the missing inventory reports with duty rosters, training schedules, and personnel movements. 3 names appeared consistently in connection with the irregularities: Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant Thompson, and surprisingly, Captain Hayes. The inclusion of Hayes was troubling. Sandra had observed the captain for months and seen no indicators of corruption or illegal activity. Hayes appeared to be a dedicated officer with a clean record and strong leadership qualities. But the data didn't lie. Hayes had signed off on several of the questionable inventory reports. At 1600 hours, Sandra witnessed something that provided another piece of the puzzle. She was emptying trash bins near the administrative offices when she saw Thompson enter the building through a side entrance that was supposed to be secured after normal duty hours. He was carrying a small duffel bag and moving with the careful awareness of someone conducting unauthorized business. Sandra positioned herself where she could observe without being detected. Thompson proceeded to the armory access corridor, an area that should have been off limits to someone of his rank without proper authorization and escort. But he entered without challenge, suggesting he either had legitimate access or had compromised the security systems. 20 minutes later, Thompson emerged without the duffel bag. His body language was different, more relaxed, less purposeful. Whatever he'd accomplished in the armory had been successful. Sandra waited another 10 minutes before discreetly following Thompson's route. The corridor was empty, but she could see evidence of recent activity. Scuff marks on the floor, a faint smell of gun oil in the air, and most tellingly, a security camera that had been temporarily repositioned to face the wall rather than the access door. Someone had definitely been conducting unauthorized activities in the armory, and they'd been careful to avoid leaving electronic evidence. But they hadn't anticipated that a cafeteria worker might be conducting her own surveillance. The discovery represented both an opportunity and a risk. Sandra now had concrete evidence of illegal activity, but she also knew that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. The people involved in this operation were professionals who would eventually notice if someone was paying too much attention to their activities. As Sandra finished her shift and prepared to leave for the day, she mentally reviewed what she'd learned. Williams appeared to be either an unwilling participant or a potential whistleblower. Morrison and Thompson were clearly central to the operation. Hayes' involvement remained unclear but couldn't be ignored. The missing weapons were being systematically diverted through a sophisticated network that included proper documentation and security protocols. The operation had been running for at least 18 months, which meant significant quantities of military assets had already reached the black market. Most importantly, Sandra was certain that these were the weapons responsible for her brother's death. The timeline matched, the methodology was consistent, and the level of sophistication explained how military-grade weapons had reached street criminals in such good condition. But having suspicions and proving them were different things entirely. Sandra needed evidence that would hold up in court, evidence that would identify everyone involved in the network, and evidence that would prevent future thefts. Getting that evidence would require taking risks that could expose her true identity and end her investigation before she could complete it. But after 8 months of careful preparation, Sandra was ready to move from passive observation to active intervention. The people who killed Miguel had no idea that their quiet cafeteria worker was about to become their worst nightmare. The crisis began at 0847 hours on a Friday morning when Gunnery Sergeant Michael Rodriguez burst through the cafeteria doors, his face flushed with frustration and barely contained anger. Behind him followed 3 Marine instructors and a group of advanced training candidates who were supposed to be conducting their final marksmanship assessment. "Kitchens closed until further notice," Rodriguez announced to the handful of late breakfast stragglers. "We've got a situation that requires immediate attention." Sandra continued wiping down the serving counter, but her senses went into high alert. In her experience, situations at military facilities rarely involved anything good, and the tension radiating from Rodriguez suggested this was serious. "What's the problem, Gunny?" asked Corporal Davis, one of the Marines who'd been finishing his coffee. "Primary sniper rifle for the assessment just went completely dead," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the kind of frustration that comes from equipment failures at the worst possible time. Not just a jam or feeding issue, the entire firing mechanism seems to be locked up. Trigger won't respond, bolt won't cycle, nothing. Sandra's hands paused imperceptibly in their cleaning motion. Weapon malfunctions during critical assessments were exactly the kind of disruption that could provide opportunities for closer observation of personnel under stress. Staff Sergeant Patricia Chun, the lead marksmanship instructor, shook her head. Grimly, "I've been working on military weapons for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like someone sabotaged the internal mechanisms." The word sabotaged hung in the air like a physical presence. Sandra noted the immediate change in body language among the assembled Marines. Shoulders straightened, eyes became more alert, and the casual atmosphere of morning coffee was replaced by tactical awareness. Could someone have tampered with it deliberately? Asked Lieutenant Morrison, who'd appeared in the doorway with suspicious timing. Sandra observed his expression carefully. Genuine surprise or practiced deception? That's what we're trying to determine, Rodriguez replied. But right now, we've got 6 candidates who need to complete their final assessment, and our backup rifle is in the armory for scheduled maintenance. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The candidates had spent months preparing for this assessment, and any delay could derail their career progression. Military schedules didn't accommodate equipment failures, especially when those failures might be the result of sabotage. "Sir," said one of the candidates, Private First Class Jackson, "couldn't we use one of the standard M4 South for the assessment? I know it's not the same as the precision rifle, but—" "Negative," Chun interrupted. "This assessment specifically requires long-range precision shooting. The standards can't be modified just because we're having equipment problems." Sandra made a decision that would change everything. Setting down her cleaning cloth, she approached the group of frustrated Marines with the same deferential manner she'd cultivated for 8 months. "Excuse me, Gunnery Sergeant," she said quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing about the rifle problem. I might be able to help." The silence that followed was profound. Every Marine in the room turned to stare at the middle-aged cafeteria worker, who apparently thought she could solve a weapons malfunction that had stumped their most experienced instructors. Rodriguez's expression cycled through confusion, irritation, and finally a kind of patronizing patience. "Ma'am, I appreciate you wanting to help, but this is a precision military weapon system. It requires specialized knowledge and training to—" "The trigger assembly is probably experiencing sear engagement failure," Sandra continued, her voice remaining soft but carrying an undercurrent of technical authority that made several Marines straighten up. "If the bolt face is locked in battery position but the trigger won't release, you're looking at either a disconnector malfunction or debris interference in the trigger mechanism housing." The technical specificity of her diagnosis created another moment of stunned silence. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Chun, both recognizing that Sandra's assessment was far more sophisticated than anything a civilian should know about military weapons. "How could you possibly ... Chun began, then trailed off as she tried to process what she'd just heard. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching suspicion. "Ma'am, that's a very specific diagnosis for someone who works in food service. Where exactly did you learn about weapon trigger mechanisms?" Sandra had anticipated this moment for months. Her cover story was carefully constructed, but she knew that demonstrating expertise would inevitably raise questions. "My late husband was a Marine," she said, allowing a note of sadness to enter her voice. "He used to work on his personal rifles at home, and I picked up some things over the years." It was a plausible explanation, one that played into the Marines' natural respect for military families while providing a reasonable source for her knowledge. But Sandra could see that Morrison wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. "Even so," Rodriguez said diplomatically, "military weapons are quite different from civilian rifles. The tolerances and specifications are. Would you like me to take a look at it?" Sandra interrupted gently. "I understand if you'd prefer to handle it through proper channels, but I might be able to identify the specific problem and save some time." The offer created a dilemma for the Marine leadership. Protocol dictated that unauthorized personnel shouldn't handle military weapons, but they were facing a time-sensitive situation with limited options. 6 careers were potentially on hold because of equipment failure. Chun made the decision. What could it hurt to let her look at it? She might spot something we missed. Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. "Bring the rifle down here." "But ma'am," he added, looking directly at Sandra, "you understand this weapon doesn't leave our direct supervision, and you're only authorized to examine it not to make any modifications. Of course, Gunnery Sergeant. I completely understand. 2. Marines retrieved the problematic rifle from the range and set it up on a table in the cafeteria's main dining area. Sandra approached the weapon with the kind of systematic care that spoke of extensive experience with similar systems. The rifle was a precision instrument, a military sniper system with advanced optics and custom modifications designed for long range. Accuracy. Sandra examined the external components first, checking the scope mounts, bolt assembly, and trigger guard housing. The external components look fine, she said, speaking primarily to Chun and Rodriguez, but aware that Morrison was watching her every movement. The problem is definitely internal. Asterisk. With practiced efficiency, Sandra began field stripping the rifle, separating the major components with smooth, economical movements that suggested deep familiarity with the process. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that comes from thousands of hours of training and experience. "Jesus," whispered one of the candidates. "She knows what she's doing." Sandra isolated the trigger assembly and examined it under the cafeteria's fluorescent lighting. What she found confirmed her initial diagnosis, but also revealed something more troubling. "Here's your problem," she said, pointing to a small component within the trigger mechanism. "The sear spring has been deliberately overtensioned. Someone adjusted it beyond operational specifications, which caused the disconnector to bind against the trigger bow." The word "deliberately" sent a chill through the assembled Marines. Sandra's diagnosis confirmed that the weapon malfunction wasn't accidental, it was sabotage. "Are you saying someone intentionally damaged this rifle?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Someone with knowledge of precision rifle mechanics modified the trigger assembly in a way that would cause failure under operational conditions," Sandra confirmed. "It's not random damage, it's a very specific type of sabotage that would be difficult to detect without complete disassembly." Morrison's face had gone pale, and Sandra noticed his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Either he was genuinely outraged by the sabotage, or he was concerned that his operation was being exposed. "Can you fix it?" Shun asked. Sandra examined the damaged components more carefully. "The sear spring needs to be replaced, and the disconnector will need to be recalibrated. But I can make temporary adjustments that should restore basic functionality." Working with tools borrowed from the facility's maintenance department, Sandra began making precise modifications to the trigger assembly. Her movements were confident and methodical, displaying a level of expertise that clearly exceeded anything a Marine widow should have learned from watching her husband work on civilian rifles. 25 minutes later, Sandra had the rifle reassembled and functional. She performed a dry fire test, checking the trigger response and bolt cycling. Everything operated smoothly. "That should do it," she said, stepping back from the weapon. "The trigger pull might be slightly different from what you're used to, but it should function reliably for your assessment." Rodriguez took the rifle and performed his own operational check. The weapon functioned perfectly, with no trace of the previous malfunction. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "that was exceptional work. Where exactly did you say you learned to do that?" Sandra could feel the weight of attention from every Marine in the room. Her demonstration of expertise had solved their immediate problem, but it had also raised questions that could threaten her carefully maintained cover identity. "Like I said, my husband taught me some things," she replied, maintaining her modest demeanor despite the suspicious looks she was receiving. "He always said that understanding how something works helps you take better care of it." But Sandra could see that her explanation was no longer sufficient. The level of skill she demonstrated went far beyond casual observation of a hobbyist. She just performed precision mechanical work on a military weapon system with the confidence and expertise of a professional armorer. Morrison was studying her with undisguised suspicion, his earlier politeness replaced by calculating assessment. Sandra realized that her cover might be in jeopardy, but she'd also confirmed something important. Someone with access to the rifle had deliberately sabotaged it. In a facility where weapons were disappearing and unauthorized personnel were accessing secure areas. Equipment sabotage suggested that the situation was escalating beyond simple theft. Someone was actively trying to disrupt military operations, and Sandra was beginning to suspect she knew who. The test of her technical skills had been passed, but it had also marked the beginning of a much more dangerous phase of her investigation. Marksmanship assessment proceeded flawlessly with Sandra's repaired rifle, but the atmosphere in the cafeteria had fundamentally changed. Word of the civilian worker who diagnosed and fixed military equipment spread through the base like wildfire, reaching personnel who'd never given Sandra Lopez a second thought. By Monday morning, Sandra found herself the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations. Marines who'd treated her as invisible furniture for 8 months were now studying her with new interest. The transformation was exactly what she'd hoped to avoid, but the sabotaged rifle had forced her hand. "Morning, Sandy," said Corporal Davis as he approached the serving line, but his tone carried none of the casual dismissal it had held for months. "Heard you really saved the day last Friday." "Just lucky I could help," Sandra replied, maintaining her modest demeanor while noting the analytical way Davis was studying her movements. "Sometimes you pick up useful skills when you least expect it." Behind Davis, she could see Lieutenant Morrison observing the interaction from across the dining area. He'd been watching her constantly since Friday, his attention shifting from casual surveillance to active investigation. Sandra realized she was walking a tightrope, appearing knowledgeable enough to be credible, but not so expert as to blow her cover entirely. The real test came during the afternoon lull when Captain Hayes approached Sandra's cleaning station with an expression that mixed curiosity with professional concern. "Ms. Lopez, could I speak with you privately for a few minutes?" Hayes' tone was polite, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. Sandra followed Hayes to a quiet corner table, her mind racing through possible explanations and cover stories. The captain had always been courteous, but this felt different, more like an interrogation than a friendly conversation. "I've been thinking about what happened Friday," Hayes began, settling into her chair with the relaxed posture of someone preparing for a lengthy discussion. "Your knowledge of that rifle's trigger mechanism was remarkably sophisticated." "I got lucky with the diagnosis," Sandra replied. "Sometimes problems are simpler than they appear." Hayes studied Sandra's face carefully. "I've been working with military weapons for 15 years, and I've seen maybe 3 or 4 Marines who could have performed that repair as efficiently as you did. It wasn't luck, it was expertise." The observation was accurate and dangerous. Sandra needed to provide enough explanation to satisfy Hayes' curiosity without revealing information that could compromise her mission. "My husband was very dedicated to understanding his equipment," Sandra said, allowing a note of pride to enter her voice. "He believed that lives depended on knowing every component, every potential failure point. I suppose I absorbed more than I realized." "What unit did your husband serve with?" Hayes asked, and Sandra recognized the question as a trap. Military records were easily verified, and any inconsistency in her story would be quickly discovered. 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Sandra replied, providing details from her carefully constructed backstory. "He did 3 tours in Afghanistan before ... She let her voice trail off, suggesting painful memories she couldn't discuss. Hayes' expression softened slightly, recognizing the signs of someone dealing with loss. But her next question indicated she wasn't entirely satisfied with Sandra's explanations. "Have you ever considered that your skills might be valuable to the Corps? We're always looking for qualified civilian contractors who understand military systems." The offer was both an opportunity and a potential trap. Sandra realized that Hayes might be testing her, trying to determine if she had ulterior motives for working at the base. Or perhaps the captain was genuinely impressed and wanted to utilize Sandra's apparent expertise. I appreciate the thought, Captain, but I'm content with my current position. Serving meals to Marines is my way of honoring my husband's memory. Before Hayes could respond, Staff Sergeant Williams appeared at their table, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. The deterioration in his condition was alarming. Whatever pressure he was under had intensified significantly since their previous conversation. Captain Hayes, Williams said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, I need to speak with you immediately. It's about the inventory discrepancies we discussed last week. Hayes glanced at Sandra, clearly torn between continuing their conversation and addressing what appeared to be an urgent military matter. Professional responsibility won out. Ms. Lopez, thank you for your time. Perhaps we can continue this conversation later. Hayes stood and moved away with Williams, their voices dropping to urgent whispers. Sandra began cleaning the nearby tables, positioning herself where she could observe their interaction without appearing to eavesdrop. What she saw confirmed her growing suspicions about the complexity of the situation at Quantico. Williams was agitated to the point of near panic, gesturing frantically while speaking in rapid, desperate tones. Hayes listened with growing alarm, her expression shifting from professional concern to genuine fear. Whatever Williams was telling her, it was information that threatened both of them. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact was immediate. Hayes left the cafeteria with the purposeful stride of someone facing a crisis, while Williams remained at the table, staring into space with the 1,000-yard gaze of someone contemplating impossible choices. Sandra approached Williams' table, ostensibly to clean it, but actually to assess his condition. Up close, she could see that he was exhibiting signs of severe stress, rapid breathing, excessive perspiration, and the kind of hypervigilance that suggested immediate danger. Staff Sergeant, she said quietly, are you feeling all right? You look like you might need some water or fresh air. Williams looked up at her with eyes that were haunted by fear and desperation. For a moment, Sandra thought he might break down completely. Then his expression hardened with resolve. Sandra, he said, using her name for the first time, you seem like a good person. Someone who cares about doing the right thing. The statement felt like a prelude to something significant. Sandra nodded encouragingly, maintaining her concerned civilian persona while preparing for whatever revelation Williams was building toward. Asterisk. If you ever saw something wrong happening here, something that could hurt people, would you report it? Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Sandra replied. But Staff Sergeant, if you're aware of something dangerous, shouldn't you be talking to your commanding officers rather than, what if the commanding officers are part of the problem? Williams interrupted, his voice cracking with desperation. What if the people you're supposed to trust are the ones causing the damage? The admission confirmed Sandra's worst suspicions. The weapons theft operation wasn't being conducted by a few rogue individuals. It involved personnel at multiple levels of the command structure. People with authority, access, and the ability to cover their tracks through official channels. Staff Sergeant, Sandra said carefully, if you have information about wrongdoing, there are proper channels. The proper channels are compromised, Williams hissed. The people stealing weapons, selling them to criminals on the street, they're using official procedures to cover their tracks. They have access to inventory systems, transportation protocols, everything they need to make thefts look like legitimate transfers. Sandra's pulse quickened. Williams was describing exactly the kind of sophisticated operation she'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed by someone inside the conspiracy was both validating and terrifying. How do you know all this? She asked. Williams was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. Because they tried to recruit me 6 months ago. They offered me money to falsify inventory reports, to create paperwork that would explain missing equipment, when I refused. He gestured to his deteriorated appearance. Let's just say they made it clear that refusal wasn't really an option. Then, why haven't you reported this to federal authorities? The FBI, military investigators. Because I don't know how high this goes, Williams replied. I don't know who's involved, who can be trusted, who might be working with them. All I know is that people are going to die because of what's happening here, and I can't figure out how to stop it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Thompson, who approached their table with the kind of casual confidence that immediately put Sandra on alert. His timing felt deliberate, as if he'd been monitoring Williams' activities. Staff Sergeant Williams, Thompson said, his tone friendly but carrying an undercurrent of warning. The lieutenant is looking for you. Something about updating those training schedules we discussed. Williams went pale, recognizing the message for what it was, a summons that couldn't be ignored. He stood unsteadily, nodding to Sandra with an expression that seemed to convey both gratitude and apology. Thank you for the conversation, ma'am, he said formally. I hope we can talk again soon. Thompson waited until Williams was out of earshot before turning his attention to Sandra. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes were calculating in a way that made her skin crawl. Ms. Lopez, isn't it? I've been hearing interesting things about your mechanical skills. Very impressive work on that rifle last week. Just trying to help where I can, Sandra replied, maintaining her humble demeanor while noting the way Thompson was studying her. I'm curious, Thompson continued, how exactly does a cafeteria worker become so knowledgeable about military weapons? That's not exactly typical background for food service personnel. The question was direct and aggressive, lacking the diplomatic approach Hayes had used. Thompson wasn't trying to recruit Sandra or verify her story. He was interrogating her, testing whether she represented a threat to whatever operation he was running. My late husband was very thorough about teaching me equipment maintenance, Sandra said, sticking to her established cover story. He believed it was important for military families to understand the tools that keep their loved ones safe. Thompson's smile never wavered, but Sandra could see he wasn't satisfied with her explanation. That's a beautiful sentiment. I'm sure your husband would be proud to see how you're using that knowledge to serve the cause. The comment felt like a veiled threat, and Sandra realized that her demonstration of expertise had marked her as a person of interest to the wrong people. Thompson was clearly involved in the weapons theft operation, and he was now assessing whether Sandra Lopez represented a security risk. As Thompson walked away, Sandra understood that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. Williams had essentially confirmed the existence of a conspiracy involving multiple levels of command, but he was too frightened to take action. Hayes appeared to be receiving information that suggested she might be an unwitting participant or potential ally, and Thompson was now actively investigating Sandra herself, which meant her carefully maintained cover was under direct threat. After 8 months of patient observation, Sandra was finally close to identifying the full scope of the weapons theft network. But she was also running out of time before her true identity was discovered. The next phase of her investigation would require taking risks that could expose everything she'd worked for. But the alternative was allowing the people who killed her brother to continue operating with impunity. Sandra Lopez, quiet cafeteria worker, was about to disappear forever. What emerged in her place would depend on how far she was willing to go for justice. Tuesday morning brought an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos to Quantico. Sandra arrived at 0445 to find the base buzzing with unusual activity. Security patrols had been doubled, access protocols were being strictly enforced, and personnel were moving with the kind of heightened awareness that suggested something significant had happened overnight. Maria Santos met Sandra at the kitchen entrance, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "Sandy, thank God you're here," we've got a situation. Base Command is conducting some kind of emergency assessment, and they want all civilian contractors to report to the main administration building for additional security screening. Sandra's blood ran cold. Emergency security screenings were exactly the kind of investigation that could expose her fabricated identity and end her mission before she could complete it. After 8 months of careful preparation, she might be forced to abandon everything because of circumstances beyond her control. Do you know what prompted this? Sandra asked, maintaining her concerned civilian worker persona while her mind raced through contingency plans. Nobody's saying much officially, Maria replied, but the rumor is that someone reported suspicious activity involving base security. There's talk about missing equipment and possible insider threats. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Sandra's growing certainty that Williams had been pressured to make his admission to Hayes, and that pressure had apparently escalated to the point where official investigations were being launched. The question was whether this represented an opportunity to expose the conspiracy or a trap designed to eliminate potential witnesses. Sandra's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Hayes, who entered the kitchen with an expression that mixed urgency with barely controlled fear. Her usually immaculate uniform was slightly disheveled, suggesting she'd been working through the night. "Ms. Lopez," Hayes said, her voice tight with stress, "I need to speak with you immediately. It's about our conversation yesterday and some developments that have occurred since then." Sandra followed Hayes to a small office adjacent to the kitchen, noting that the captain was moving with the careful awareness of someone who believed they might be under surveillance. Hayes closed the door and activated a white noise generator standard counter-surveillance equipment that shouldn't have been necessary for a routine conversation with a cafeteria worker. "Ms. Lopez," Hayes began, then paused, studying Sandra's face intently. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Are you really just a cafeteria worker?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Sandra realized that Hayes had apparently learned something overnight that had fundamentally changed her perception of Sandra's identity and purpose at Quantico. "Captain, I'm not sure what you're asking," Sandra replied carefully. "I've been working here for 8 months, serving meals and maintaining the facilities. Is there some problem with my performance?" Hayes pulled out a tablet and activated a secure communication application. "Staff Sergeant Williams came to see me last night. He was terrified, barely coherent, but he managed to tell me some things that have completely changed my understanding of what's happening at this base." Sandra maintained her puzzled civilian expression while preparing for whatever revelation Hayes was building toward. "According to Williams," Hayes continued, "there's been a systematic theft of weapons and ammunition from our armory for over 18 months. The operation involves forged documentation, falsified inventory reports, and coordination with outside contractors who have been selling military equipment to criminal organizations." The admission confirmed everything Sandra had suspected, but hearing it from Hayes indicated that the situation was escalating beyond anyone's control. "That sounds terrible, Captain," Sandra said, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me this. I just work in the cafeteria." Hayes leaned forward, her expression intense. "Because Williams also told me that someone has been conducting surveillance of base personnel for months. Someone with advanced training who's been gathering intelligence about the theft operation. Someone who's been pretending to be a harmless civilian worker while actually investigating federal crimes." Sandra felt her carefully constructed cover identity crumbling around her. Williams had apparently observed more of her activities than she'd realized, and his desperation had led him to reveal information that could compromise everything. "Captain, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Hayes interrupted. "Williams described your movements, your observation patterns, your access to areas that should be restricted to authorized personnel. He's convinced that you're either a federal investigator or military intelligence." And honestly, after watching your performance with that rifle last Friday, I'm inclined to agree with him. Sandra realized she was facing a critical decision. She could continue denying Hayes' accusations and hope to maintain her cover long enough to complete her investigation, or she could reveal enough of the truth to potentially gain Hayes as an ally in exposing the conspiracy. The decision was made for her by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Hayes immediately tensed, recognizing the distinctive pace of someone conducting tactical movement rather than routine patrol. "We need to get out of here," Hayes whispered urgently. "If Williams is right about the scope of this conspiracy, then our conversation has probably been monitored." Before Sandra could respond, the office door burst open and Lieutenant Morrison entered, flanked by Sergeant Thompson and 2 Marines Sandra didn't recognize. All 4 men were armed and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military training and hostile intent. "Captain Hayes," Morrison said, his voice carrying official authority despite the threatening circumstances, "you and Ms. Lopez need to come with us for questioning about security irregularities." Sandra assessed the situation instantly. 4 armed men, limited escape routes, civilians in potential danger. Her CIA training kicked in automatically, analyzing threat levels and tactical options with the kind of systematic precision she'd developed through years of hostile environment operations. "Lieutenant," Hayes said, attempting to maintain command authority, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is highly inappropriate. If you have concerns about security, they should be addressed through proper channels." Morrison's smile was cold and professional. "The proper channels are exactly the problem, Captain. It seems you've been asking questions about operations that are above your clearance level." Thompson stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Ma'am, we're going to need you both to come with us quietly. This doesn't have to be difficult." Sandra realized that Morrison and Thompson had apparently decided to move from passive surveillance to active intervention. Whether they intended to eliminate witnesses or simply intimidate them into silence, the situation had escalated beyond the point where her cover identity could be maintained. "Gentlemen," Sandra said, her voice remaining calm despite the circumstances, "I think there's been some confusion. I'm just a cafeteria worker who got involved in something she doesn't understand." "Cut the act," Morrison replied. "We know you've been conducting surveillance for months. We know you have access to classified information. And we know you've been asking questions about operations that could compromise national security." The accusation was both accurate and ironic. Sandra had indeed been conducting surveillance and gathering classified information, but she was doing it to expose the very national security breaches that Morrison was apparently trying to protect. "Lieutenant Morrison," Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of superior rank, "I'm ordering you to stand down immediately. This behavior is completely out of line," and Morrison's response was to draw his sidearm and point it directly at Hayes. "Captain, with all due respect, you're not in a position to give orders right now." The situation had deteriorated to the point of armed confrontation, and Sandra realized that Morrison's group was prepared to use lethal force to protect their operation. Hayes was an innocent officer who'd stumbled into a conspiracy beyond her comprehension, and Sandra's investigation had inadvertently put the captain in mortal danger. Sandra made her decision in one fluid motion. She stepped between Morrison's weapon and Hayes while simultaneously grabbing a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the desk beside her. Her movement was so fast and unexpected that Morrison didn't have time to react before Sandra hurled the mug at his gun hand with deadly accuracy. The impact sent Morrison's weapon flying across the room while he stumbled backward, clutching his injured wrist. But Sandra was already moving, using the momentary confusion to disable Thompson with a precise strike to his solar plexus that left him gasping on the floor. The 2 unknown Marines attempted to draw their weapons, but Sandra was operating on a completely different level of training and experience. She disarmed both men with movements that were so fast and efficient, they seemed almost choreographed, leaving all four attackers on the ground within seconds. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, but it completely shattered any remaining pretense about Sandra's identity. Captain Hayes stared at her with an expression of shock and dawning comprehension. "Who are you?" Hayes whispered. Sandra looked down at Morrison, who was struggling to regain his composure while nursing his injured wrist. For 8 months, she'd maintained the persona of Sandra Lopez, humble cafeteria worker. But that woman had just ceased to exist. "My name is Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera," she said, her voice carrying the authority and precision of someone accustomed to command in life-or-death situations. "I'm a CIA operative conducting an investigation into the theft of military weapons from this facility." Morrison's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "You're a federal agent." "I'm someone whose brother was killed by weapons stolen from this base and sold to criminals on the street," Sandra replied, her voice hard with controlled anger. "I'm someone who spent 8 months gathering evidence about your operation, documenting your network and preparing to bring everyone involved to justice." She looked around the room at the 4 men she'd just disabled with embarrassing ease. "And I'm someone who just demonstrated that your little conspiracy is about to come to a very abrupt end." The quiet cafeteria worker was gone forever. In her place stood a trained operative with the skills, knowledge, and determination to dismantle the network that had killed her brother. The perfect shot wasn't fired from a rifle. It was the moment. Sandra Lopez Rivera finally revealed who she really was. The aftermath of Sandra's revelation created a tense standoff in the small office. Morrison and his 3 accomplices sat on the floor, disarmed and subdued, while Captain Hayes processed the reality that her quiet cafeteria worker was actually a federal operative. The white noise generator continued humming, providing cover for a conversation that would determine the fate of everyone in the room. "Agent Lopez Rivera," Hayes said, testing the name carefully. "I need to understand exactly what's happening here. If you're CIA, why didn't you coordinate with base security? Why conduct an unauthorized investigation on a military installation?" Sandra kept her eyes on Morrison while addressing Hayes' questions. "Because the theft operation involves personnel at multiple levels of command. I couldn't risk compromising the investigation by revealing my presence to potentially corrupt officials." Morrison laughed bitterly from his position on the floor. "You have no idea how deep this goes, Agent. You think stopping us is going to make a difference? We're just one small part of a much larger operation." "Then you're going to help me understand." "The larger operation," Sandra replied, "starting with who's giving you orders and where the stolen weapons are being distributed." "I'm not telling you anything without a lawyer present," Morrison said defiantly. "And you don't have jurisdiction here anyway. This is a military installation under military authority." Sandra pulled out her cell phone and activated a recording application. "Lieutenant Morrison, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft of government property, violation of federal firearms laws, and treason. You have the right to remain silent." "You can't arrest me," Morrison interrupted. "You're CIA, not FBI. You don't have domestic law enforcement authority." Sandra's smile was cold and professional. "Actually, I'm currently on detached duty with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which gives me full federal law enforcement powers when investigating crimes that affect national security. Theft of military weapons definitely qualifies." The revelation that Sandra had legitimate arrest authority seemed to deflate Morrison's defiance. He realized that his situation was far more serious than a jurisdictional dispute between agencies. "Captain Hayes," Sandra continued, "I need you to contact base security and request immediate assistance. Tell them we have federal prisoners who need to be secured pending transfer to FBI custody." Hayes reached for her radio, but Morrison's panicked voice stopped her. "Wait," If you call base security, you're going to get people killed. This operation has protection at levels you can't imagine. Sandra crouched down to Morrison's eye level. Then explain it to me. Who's protecting you? How high does this conspiracy go? Give me names, locations, and procedures. Morrison was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. It started 18 months ago when a private contractor approached me about providing training materials for Allied forces overseas. They said they needed small quantities of weapons and ammunition for legitimate military assistance programs. What contractor? Sandra pressed. Blackstone Security Solutions. They claimed to be working with State Department and Defense Department. Approval. The money was good and everything seemed legal. Sandra recognized the name. Blackstone had been flagged by CIA analysts as a potential front organization for arms trafficking, but they'd never been able to prove criminal activity. How did they recruit you? Haas asked, joining the interrogation. They knew about my financial problems, Morrison admitted. Gambling debts, divorce expenses, child support payments. They offered me a way to make extra money while supposedly serving national interests. Thompson, who'd been silent since Sandra disabled him, finally spoke up. We thought we were helping legitimate operations. The paperwork looked official. The authorization codes checked out. Everything seemed to be properly documented. But you knew you were stealing weapons from your own base, Sandra said. You knew you were violating your oath and betraying your fellow Marines. We told ourselves it was for a good cause, Thompson replied miserably. We convinced ourselves that providing weapons to allies was more important than following bureaucratic procedures. Sandra could see the rationalization process that had allowed otherwise decent Marines to justify treason. Criminal organizations were expert at providing moral cover for illegal activities, making participants feel like heroes rather than traitors. Who else is involved? Sandra demanded. I need names of everyone in the network. Morrison exchanged glances with Thompson before answering. Staff Sergeant Williams was supposed to be our inside man for inventory manipulation, but he refused to cooperate. That's when they started pressuring him. Who's they? Hayes asked. Blackstone has people everywhere, Morrison said. Military personnel, civilian contractors, government officials. They know how to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. Sandra's phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. Agent Lopez Rivera, we need immediately. Your investigation has compromised operational security. Colonel James Harrison, Military Intelligence. The message created a new complication. If military intelligence was involved, it could mean either that Sandra's investigation had attracted official support, or that the conspiracy had reached levels high enough to manipulate intelligence operations. Captain Hayes, Sandra said, I need you to secure these prisoners while I verify some information. Don't let anyone else enter this room, and don't communicate with anyone outside of this office until I return. Agent Lopez Rivera, Hayes said formally, I need to point out that I'm taking considerable risk by supporting an unauthorized federal investigation on my base. I need assurance that this situation is being handled properly. Sandra appreciated Hayes' position. The captain was a career officer who'd stumbled into a conspiracy that could destroy her military career if handled incorrectly. Captain, in approximately 6 hours, this base will be swarming with FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and internal affairs investigators. Your cooperation with this investigation will be noted and appreciated by everyone involved. Your failure to cooperate would be problematic. The implicit threat was clear, but Sandra softened it with a reassuring tone. You're doing the right thing, Captain. Help me finish this investigation, and everyone involved in the conspiracy will face justice. Sandra left the office and made her way to the coordinates specified in Colonel Harrison's message, a small conference room in the administration building. She moved carefully, aware that her true identity was now exposed and that unknown conspirators might be taking action. To protect their operation, Colonel Harrison was waiting for her, along with two individuals Sandra didn't recognize. Harrison was a lean man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling classified operations. His companions appeared to be federal agents based on their professional demeanor and careful positioning in the room. Agent Lopez Rivera, Harrison said as Sandra entered, "We need to discuss your unauthorized investigation and its impact on ongoing operations." "Colonel," Sandra replied, "I've been conducting a legitimate investigation into theft of military property. If that's created complications for other operations, perhaps those operations weren't as secure as you believed." One of the unknown men stepped forward. "Agent Lopez Rivera, I'm Deputy Director Marcus Webb from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. We've been monitoring Blackstone Security Solutions for 14 months as part of a federal investigation into international arms trafficking. The revelation that the FBI was already investigating Blackstone created both opportunities and complications for Sandra's mission. Deputy Director, if you've been monitoring Blackstone, then you're aware that they've been purchasing stolen military weapons from personnel at this base." "We're aware," Webb replied grimly. "What we weren't aware of was that CIA had an operative embedded at Quantico conducting a parallel investigation." Harrison leaned forward. "Agent Lopez Rivera, your investigation has inadvertently compromised our ability to track Blackstone's distribution network. By exposing Morrison and Thompson, you've forced them to accelerate their timeline and destroy evidence." Sandra felt a surge of frustration. After 8 months of careful work, she was being told that her investigation might have interfered with a larger operation. "With respect, Deputy Director," Sandra said, "my brother was killed by weapons stolen from this base. I've spent 8 months gathering evidence about the theft operation while your investigation apparently allowed it to continue." "Your brother's death was one of the factors that prompted our investigation," Webb admitted. "But we needed to trace the complete network before making arrests. Premature action could have allowed the leadership to escape prosecution." "How much longer were you planning to let this continue?" Sandra demanded. "How many more people needed to die while you gathered evidence?" Colonel Harrison answered, "Agent Lopez Rivera, Blackstone isn't just selling weapons to street criminals. They're part of an international network that supplies terrorist organizations, hostile governments, and criminal syndicates worldwide. The weapons stolen from Quantico are just a small part of their operation." The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Sandra had imagined, but it didn't change her fundamental mission. "Colonel, I respect the complexity of your investigation, but Morrison and Thompson are in custody, and they're ready to provide information about Blackstone's operations." "Which brings us to the current situation," Webb said. "Morrison and Thompson are small players who don't have access to the information we need about Blackstone's leadership and distribution networks." Sandra realized what Webb was suggesting. "You want to use them as assets to continue the investigation. We want to give them the opportunity to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences," Webb corrected. "With proper handling, they could provide access to Blackstone operations that we've never been able to penetrate." The proposal created a moral dilemma for Sandra. Morrison and Thompson had participated in the network that killed her brother, but cooperating with the larger investigation might prevent future deaths and dismantle the entire conspiracy. "What guarantees do I have that justice will be served?" Sandra asked. "You have my word that everyone involved in your brother's death will face appropriate consequences," Webb replied. "But we need to ensure that the investigation captures the entire network, not just the local participants." Sandra considered the offer. After 8 months of patient investigation, she was finally close to justice for Miguel. But the opportunity to prevent future victims by dismantling the larger conspiracy was equally important. "I'll cooperate," Sandra said finally, but I want to be involved in every aspect of the continued investigation. I've earned the right to see this through to the end. Asterisk. Colonel Harrison nodded. Agent Lopez Rivera, welcome to Operation Nightfall. Let's finish what you started. The secure conference room at Quantico had been transformed into a federal command center within hours of Sandra's integration into Operation Nightfall. Multiple computer screens displayed surveillance footage, financial records, and communication intercepts that painted a comprehensive picture of Blackstone Security Solutions' criminal enterprise. Deputy Director Webb stood before a large tactical display showing locations across 3 continents. Agent Lopez Rivera, what you uncovered at Quantico is just one node in a network that spans 14 countries and involves hundreds of participants. Sandra studied the intelligence briefings with professional interest, but her focus remained intensely personal. Deputy Director, this is all very impressive, but I want to know specifically how Blackstone's operations led to my brother's death. Colonel Harrison activated a separate display showing financial transactions and weapons tracking data. Miguel Lopez was killed during a gang confrontation in Baltimore 18 months ago. The weapons used in that incident were traced through ATF databases to a shipment that originated from this base. The confirmation that her brother's death was directly connected to the Cafeteria, Quantico thefts provided Sandra with the validation she'd sought for 8 months, but it also intensified her determination to see the investigation through to its conclusion. The weapons were sold through a distribution network that Blackstone established in 12 major cities, Webb continued. Street price markup was approximately 400%, generating millions in illegal revenue for the organization. Sandra examined the trafficking routes displayed on the tactical screen. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Weapons stolen from military bases were being processed through legitimate shipping companies, documented with falsified paperwork, and distributed through established criminal networks. How long has FBI been tracking this? Sandra asked. Active investigation began 14 months ago when ATF noticed patterns in weapons trafficking that suggested military sources, Harrison replied. But we've been aware of Blackstone's activities for almost 3 years. The timeline troubled Sandra. If federal agencies had been aware of Blackstone's operations for 3 years, Miguel's death could potentially have been prevented with earlier intervention. Agent Lopez Rivera, Webb said, apparently recognizing her frustration. I understand your concerns about our timeline, but dismantling an international arms trafficking network requires extensive coordination with foreign intelligence services and careful legal preparation. While you were coordinating, Sandra replied with controlled anger, my brother and hundreds of other people died from weapons that should have been secured on military bases. The tension in the room was broken by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Williams, who entered under FBI escort looking haggard but determined. His appearance had improved significantly since his breakdown the previous day, suggesting that federal protection had relieved some of the pressure he'd been experiencing. Staff Sergeant Williams, Colonel Harrison said, thank you for agreeing to cooperate with this investigation. Your information has been invaluable in understanding Blackstone's recruitment and operational procedures. Williams nodded nervously and took a seat at the conference table. Colonel, I want to make it clear that I never participated in any theft activities. When Lieutenant Morrison approached me about falsifying inventory reports, I refused immediately. We understand that, Staff Sergeant, Webb assured him. Your refusal to participate is actually what prompted Morrison to implement more aggressive recruitment tactics, which ultimately led to the security failures that exposed their operation. Sandra leaned forward, studying Williams carefully. Staff Sergeant, I need you to walk me through exactly how Morrison tried to recruit you. I want to understand their methods and identify potential weak points. Williams' account of Morrison's recruitment attempt revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that Blackstone employed to compromise military personnel. They targeted individuals with financial pressures, family problems, or career disappointments, offering solutions that seemed legitimate while gradually escalating commitment to illegal activities. They made it sound patriotic, Williams explained. Morrison said we were supporting allied forces who couldn't access weapons through official channels because of bureaucratic delays. He showed me documentation that looked completely legitimate. What kind of documentation? Sandra asked. Purchase orders with Department of Defense letterhead, shipping manifests for overseas delivery, even communications that appeared to be from State Department officials authorizing the transfers. The level of sophistication indicated that Blackstone had access to government systems and procedures that allowed them to create convincing false documentation. This suggested either compromised personnel within federal agencies or sophisticated cybercriminal capabilities. Webb activated another display showing intercepted communications between Blackstone operatives. Over the past 6 months, we've identified at least 12 military installations where similar recruitment operations are being conducted. Quantico was actually one of their smaller operations. The scope of the conspiracy continued to expand beyond what Sandra had imagined. What she'd discovered through 8 months of investigation was apparently just a small part of a massive criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple levels of American military and government infrastructure. Deputy Director, Sandra said, what's the plan for dismantling this network? How do we ensure that everyone responsible faces justice? Harrison pulled up a timeline showing coordinated operations across multiple locations. Operation Nightfall will conduct simultaneous raids on 14 facilities tomorrow at 0600 hours. We'll arrest approximately 60 individuals and seize assets worth an estimated $40 million. The scale of the operation was impressive, but Sandra remained focused on the specific individuals responsible for her brother's death. What about Morrison and Thompson? What about the Blackstone personnel who directly coordinated the Quantico operation? Morrison and Thompson will face federal charges carrying potential life sentences, Webb replied. But their cooperation in identifying Blackstone's leadership could result in reduced sentences. Sandra wasn't satisfied with the possibility of reduced sentences for people who'd participated in her brother's murder. But she recognized that securing testimony against higher-level conspirators might prevent future deaths. Agent Lopez Rivera. Colonel Harrison said, we'd like you to participate in tomorrow's operations. Your investigation provided crucial intelligence about Blackstone's methods, and your presence during arrests could help secure additional cooperation from low-level participants. The invitation to participate in the raids was both professional recognition of Sandra's contribution and an opportunity for personal closure. After 8 months of undercover investigation, she would finally see justice served against the network that killed Miguel. Where will the primary arrests take place? Sandra asked. Blackstone's apparent headquarters is located in a warehouse complex outside Richmond, Webb replied. Intelligence suggests that's where they coordinate distribution, operations, and store weapons awaiting shipment. Sandra studied the facility layouts and surveillance photographs. The warehouse complex was substantial, with multiple buildings, extensive security systems, and what appeared to be significant defensive preparations. How many people do we expect to encounter at the primary location? She asked. Surveillance indicates approximately 15 to 20 individuals on site at any given time, Harrison replied. But we're preparing for the possibility of armed resistance. The prospect of armed confrontation with Blackstone operatives didn't concern Sandra. She'd faced similar situations multiple times during her CIA career. But the possibility that evidence might be destroyed during raids was troubling. What measures are being taken to preserve evidence? Sandra asked. If Blackstone suspects law enforcement action, they might attempt to destroy records or eliminate witnesses. Webb's expression became grim. That's actually our primary concern. Morrison's arrest yesterday may have triggered security protocols that alert Blackstone to law enforcement interest. The timing issue created urgency that hadn't existed when Sandra was conducting her covert investigation. Now that her cover was blown and federal agencies were involved, Blackstone would be implementing countermeasures designed to protect their leadership and preserve their operations. How do we prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing the country? Sandra asked. We don't, Harrison admitted. That's why tomorrow's raids need to be perfectly coordinated and executed simultaneously. Any delay or compromise could allow the entire network to disappear. Sandra realized that Operation Nightfall represented both the culmination of her 8-month investigation and the beginning of a much larger law enforcement action. The quiet cafeteria worker who'd patiently gathered intelligence about local weapons theft was about to become a federal agent, participating in an international counterterrorism operation. The next 18 hours would determine whether justice would be served for Miguel's death and whether hundreds of future victims would be saved by dismantling Blackstone's criminal enterprise. But first, Sandra had to prepare for the most dangerous phase of her investigation: direct confrontation with the people who'd been profiting from her brother's murder. The transformation from Sandra Lopez, invisible cafeteria worker, to Agent Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera, federal operative, was finally complete. Tomorrow she would face the people responsible for destroying her family and ensure that they never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. Operation Nightfall was about to begin, and Sandra was ready for war. At 0530 hours, Sandra crouched behind an armored vehicle in the pre-dawn darkness outside Blackstone Security Solutions warehouse complex near Richmond. The past 18 hours had been spent in intensive briefings, equipment preparation, and coordination with federal tactical teams. Now, after 8 months of patient investigation, she was minutes away from confronting the people directly responsible for her brother's death. Nightfall teams report ready status, came the voice of Deputy Director Webb through her tactical radio. Across the country, similar teams were positioned outside 13 other Blackstone facilities, waiting for the coordinated strike that would dismantle the entire network. Sandra checked her equipment one final time: body armor, tactical communications, and the service weapon she hadn't carried since beginning her undercover assignment at Quantico. The weight felt familiar and reassuring, a reminder of her true identity as a federal operative rather than a humble cafeteria worker. Agent Lopez Rivera, said Special Agent Miller, the tactical team leader, remember that your primary role is intelligence gathering and suspect identification. Let the tactical team handle any armed resistance. Sandra nodded, but privately. She was prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure that Blackstone's leadership didn't escape justice. After everything she'd sacrificed to reach this moment, she wasn't going to let bureaucratic caution prevent her from completing her mission. All Nightfall teams, execute, execute, Webb's voice commanded. The warehouse complex erupted into controlled chaos as federal agents breached multiple entry points simultaneously. Sandra followed the tactical team through the primary entrance, her weapon drawn and her senses heightened to maximum alertness. The interior of the warehouse was exactly what intelligence had predicted: rows of shipping containers, loading equipment, and office spaces that appeared to be legitimate business operations. But Sandra's trained eye immediately spotted the indicators of illegal activity: weapon storage areas, sophisticated communication equipment, and security measures far beyond what a normal shipping company would require. Federal agents, get down on the ground. The shouts echoed through the warehouse as Blackstone personnel were confronted by heavily armed FBI teams. Most complied immediately, but Sandra could hear sounds of resistance from the office areas where the leadership was likely located. She moved through the warehouse systematically, checking shipping containers and storage areas for evidence of the weapons trafficking operation. What she found exceeded even her expectations: military weapons, ammunition, and equipment worth millions of dollars, all carefully cataloged and prepared for shipment to unknown destinations. "Agent Lopez Rivera, we need you in the main office." Miller's voice crackled through her radio. "We've got someone who claims he wants to negotiate." Sandra made her way to the administrative section of the warehouse, where she found FBI agents. Surrounding a well-dressed man in his 50s who was seated calmly at a conference table, despite the chaos around him. His composure suggested either remarkable self-control or the confidence of someone who believed he had protection at levels that could override federal law enforcement. "You must be the famous cafeteria worker," the man said as Sandra entered the room. "I'm Martin Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Security Solutions. I understand you've caused considerable disruption to our operations." Sandra studied Blackstone carefully, noting the expensive clothing, manicured appearance, and subtle body language that suggested extensive experience with high-pressure situations. This was someone accustomed to wielding power and influence at levels that most people couldn't imagine. "Mr. Blackstone," Sandra replied, "I'm Agent Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera, and you're under arrest for conspiracy, arms trafficking, and murder." Blackstone's laugh was genuinely amused. "Agent Lopez Rivera, I think you misunderstand the situation. Blackstone Security Solutions operates under contracts with the United States government. Our activities are authorized at the highest levels of the Defense Department and State Department." The claim of government authorization was exactly what Sandra had expected. Sophisticated criminal organizations always claimed legitimate backing when confronted by law enforcement. But she'd prepared for this moment during months of intelligence analysis. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, pulling out a tablet containing financial records, "your organization has generated over $40 million in illegal weapons sales over the past 3 years. Those funds have been transferred to accounts in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Those are legitimate business transactions," Blackstone replied smoothly. "We provide military equipment to allied governments and authorized contractors. If some of that equipment has been misused by third parties, that's beyond our control." Sandra felt her anger building, but maintained professional composure. "Mr. Blackstone, weapons stolen from Quantico Marine Base were used to kill my brother in Baltimore 18 months ago. Your organization directly facilitated his murder." For the first time, Blackstone's confident expression flickered slightly. "Agent Lopez Rivera, I'm sorry for your loss, but you're mistaken about our involvement. We don't sell weapons to criminal organizations." "Then explain this," Sandra said, activating a recording of intercepted communications between Blackstone operatives and street-level weapons dealers. The conversations clearly established coordination between Blackstone's distribution network and criminal organizations in multiple cities. Blackstone listened to the recordings with growing discomfort, recognizing that his organization's communications had been compromised more extensively than he'd realized. "Agent Lopez Rivera," he said finally, "I think we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement. Blackstone has information about arms trafficking networks that your government would find very valuable. In exchange for cooperation, perhaps we could discuss reduced charges." The attempted negotiation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Director Webb, whose expression suggested that the other raids had been successful. "Mr. Blackstone," Webb announced, "I'm pleased to inform you that federal agents have arrested 63 members of your organization this morning and seized assets worth $43 million. Your international arms trafficking network has been completely dismantled." The news that the entire operation had been rolled up simultaneously seemed to break Blackstone's composure. For the first time, he appeared to understand that his situation was hopeless. "In addition," Webb continued, "we've recovered documentation that establishes direct connections between your organization and terrorist groups in 4 countries. You're looking at federal charges that could result in multiple life sentences." Sandra watched Blackstone's reaction carefully, noting the moment when his arrogance finally gave way to genuine fear. After years of operating with apparent impunity, he was finally facing consequences for his actions. "Mr. Blackstone," Sandra said, "I want you to know that every weapon you sold, every life you destroyed, every family you shattered, it's all over now. You're going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison, thinking about the people you killed for money." Blackstone's response was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, who carried additional evidence that had been recovered from the warehouse computers. "Agent Lopez Rivera," Harrison said, "we found specific records documenting the weapons used in your brother's death. The transaction records show that Blackstone personally authorized the sale of those weapons to known criminal associates." The confirmation that Blackstone had directly authorized the sale of the weapons that killed Miguel provided Sandra with the closure she'd sought for 8 months. The man responsible for her brother's death was sitting in handcuffs facing justice for his crimes. "Mr. Blackstone," Sandra said, "Miguel Lopez was 24 years old when your weapons killed him. He was a Marine who served his country with honor, and he died because you decided that money was more important than human life." Blackstone finally spoke, his voice subdued and defeated. "Agent Lopez Rivera, I never intended for innocent people to be hurt. We thought we were providing equipment for legitimate security operations." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Sandra replied. "You built a criminal empire on the blood of people like my brother, and now you're going to pay for every life you destroyed." As federal agents prepared to transport Blackstone and his associates to detention facilities, Sandra felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, the network responsible for Miguel's death had been dismantled, and hundreds of future victims had been saved by Operation Nightfall's success. But victory came with the recognition that Miguel was gone forever, and that no amount of justice could restore what had been taken from her family. 6 months later, Sandra stood in a federal courthouse as Martin Blackstone was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Morrison and Thompson received 25-year sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Staff Sergeant Williams was granted immunity and received commendation for his assistance in exposing the conspiracy. The woman who'd spent 8 months serving meals to Marines while secretly conducting one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in recent history had finally achieved justice for her brother's death. Sandra Cristina Lopez Rivera had proven that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who appear completely harmless. As she left the courthouse, Sandra reflected on the transformation from grieving sister to federal operative to quiet hero. The cafeteria worker who'd been invisible to the Marines she served had turned out to be the most important person in their lives, the one who protected them from the enemies hiding within their own ranks. Miguel's death had been avenged. Blackstone's network had been destroyed. And Sandra had discovered that sometimes the perfect shot isn't fired from a weapon. It's the moment when justice finally finds its target. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.